Hello? Got to unmute yourself before you put it in. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I'm going to be talking, or should I say, a big welcome to my animation factory. I wish I could be saying chocolate factory, but we can dream about chocolate at least throughout this presentation. My name is Rebecca. Thanks for the introduction. I am normally an Android developer. I wish I was a Lindt chocolatier, so maybe if I keep saying this, it'll come true one day. But I'm going to be explaining and welcoming you into my animation factory. So I've been living in a world of pure Android animation for a while. And I would like to invite you in today to show you the many different ways in which you can animate your apps and things within your app to make a more delightful experience, more as if you were in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So we've all seen some really great animation examples in various different apps that we've used, and we've probably thought to ourselves, wow, these are really good, and I just don't know where to start or how to get started with it. So these are a couple of my favorite animations that I've seen scattered on the web in people's presentations, example code, that kind of thing. The first one on the side here is using MotionLayout, and that one's by Chris Baines, which is one of my favorites, where the poster of the image goes behind the view. Another one is the jelly toolbar. I kind of like how it wobbles on the screen when you click on it. I don't know if it's really good UX, but it looks cool. And then the Android Dev Summit has some really nice AnimatedVectorDrawable animations. And then there's another one by Alexio Motta and Nick Butcher in the Nike Sneakers app, which is like a background that animates and does some cool custom view animations. So if you were like me a couple years ago, you're probably asking yourself, how do I achieve these cool animation effects? Like, my designer's got this idea in mind, maybe they've sent you a visual animation or like a moving thing that you need to implement, and you're asking yourself, how do I actually do this? So I'm very glad to be helping out today and taking you on this tour of how to use these different kinds of animations. But we won't be looking at all of them, okay? Because on Android, there is probably about 10 different ways to animate different things in your app. So the kinds of animations that we're going to be looking at today include animated vector drawables, using Shapeshifter, looking at property animations, looking at custom view animations, and physics-based animations, and then a brief look at motion layout as well. So like I said, not the only ways to animate things in Android. So there's a few different ways. But you can at least get an idea of how to use these different kinds today. So this presentation is, there's an example app that you can go and view. A lot of the examples that I'm going to be demonstrating today will be in this GitHub repository. So animated vector drawables, using Lottie, custom views, motion layout, all those things that we're going to be covering. So if you want to grab the GitHub repo, you can grab it over there. Okay, so let's talk about the first type, which is animated vector drawables. So what is an animated vector drawable? Well, it is a vector drawable with an animator set or object animator included in it. And now at this point, you're probably asking, well, what is a vector drawable? I don't know what that is. So a vector drawable is a scalable density-independent asset. So this means if you make it as large as your screen or something like that, it won't lose precision. It'll still look really nice and smooth on your screen. You won't have jagged edges. It is scalable to any device size that or any size view that you put it into. And it's represented by paths. So you basically, if you look at what a vector drawable looks like, you can actually dive into like, it's a line that is represented and moved from here to here. It's a curve, it's a cube, a cubic path, that kind of thing. And this might sound very familiar to if you've ever looked at the SVG spec, okay? And that is exactly what an animated or vector drawable is just a subset of the SVG spec. So the SVG spec has a couple other things that a vector drawable can't do. So you can't do things like blurring and shadows and stuff like that, but you still get your paths, your fill, your stroke, that kind of thing. And one thing with animated vector drawables is that they're a fire and forget animation. So this means you can't pause it at a certain point. Once you start it, it has to finish or like run to completion. And you also don't get notified of like its progress. So you can't set a certain progress at a certain point. So they're very good for small little icons that you want to animate. So in this example is two that I've made. So the first one is an icon that I have put in my app, which is just to increase the spacing of letters when you're drawing text on a screen. And the second one is just a bin opening and closing. Okay, but if you've looked at the documentation for how to create these on the Android developer documents, you will see you kind of have to have an understanding of how these paths work, and like you just need to really be drawing the paths yourself and like exploring that avenue. And for me, somebody who's very visual, it's not as easy for me to like visualize numbers as an icon like that. So now we can have a look at a tool called Shapeshifter, which really helps make these animations a lot easier for you to make. So you don't need to be manually editing paths yourself. Using Shapeshifter, we can do this quite easily. So what is Shapeshifter? It's an online tool that can be found at shapeshifter.design. And it allows you to create animations for Android, iOS, and web. So not just for Android, but for other platforms as well. And you can animate various different things of SVG or of a vector drawable. And things such as your path data, the alpha, color, stroke width, that kind of thing. And it's made by a guy called Alex Lockwood, and he's got a lot of great content online about how to use it, so definitely try follow him to see more about it. But today I'm going to be showing you how I've made like a simple animation within this tool. So this is what the tool looks like, and this is one of the animations that I've made in it. And basically this is just like a fill bucket, as if you're like in a paint program and you're trying to fill. So it tips over, the paint empties, and the drop moves further down. And this you can achieve within Shapeshifter. Okay, but how did I get to this point? It's probably what you're asking. Well, I like to kind of follow these sort of 4 steps to get to this point. So the first thing I do is I choose or make the icons that I'm going to animate between. And this is probably the most difficult part, because knowing what states you want your animation to go in between is really difficult, and like trying to decide how to animate an icon, that's probably the thing that you need to think about the most. And by me saying make your icon, I mean you might need to go and edit it into Sketch and like extract certain parts and put it in Shapeshifter. So there might be like a little bit of back and forth working in Sketch or something, like, or with a designer for that. And then step 2 is to import them into Shapeshifter. So we'll get into how to do that. Step 3, animate the stuff. So in my case, I'm going to be animating path data, but there's a bunch of different things you can do, like rotations, scale, that kind of thing. And then step 4, hopefully you have some magic and people are delighted with your little icon animations when they press them in your app. Okay, so we've got these 2 icons and we want to animate between them. So these icons are from the Material Design icon website, and it's for when you want to align text. So centering text is the first icon and justified text is the second one. And I think to animate between these 2 states, I would like to just elongate those 2 middle bars and make them like just stretch out and in, basically. So sounds simple enough. Let's go about putting this in Shapeshifter and making this work. So the first thing I've done is downloaded the icons straight from the Material Design website. I didn't do anything in Sketch with these icons, they were straight from there. So the next step would be to actually take these 2 icons and import them into Shapeshifter. So by import, I just mean select it, drag it into Shapeshifter, and it asks you if you want to add that as a layer. And then we do it for the second one as well. So the fully justified one, we say add a layer. But now we've got these 2 layers that are on top of one another. It's not really what we want. We want to animate between these 2 different paths. So you'll see at the bottom we've got the 2 paths, path and path 2. So the next step that we want to do is actually we want to animate path 1 or path into path 1. So what we do is we select next to the path, we select the little animate icon, and we select path data. And now at this point we have, like, over time we want to copy the path data of the second layer and place that as like the end state of the path, the first path data animation. We can then delete the path data, the second one, and make it as long as run as long as we want to. So now you can see we've got this animation that's happening between two path datas. Looks good, right? No. Okay, well, this is where, like, certain problems come in, and that's why I say you might need to take a few more steps to get to where you want to get to. But the first step in order to fix this animation, to make it just those middle two bars, is to use a tool called pairing subpaths within this Shapeshifter tool. So what you do is you click on the path data that's being animated, and you click on the little edit icon at the top. And now you get into this thing where you have two states, the start and end, and you need to pair the subpaths. So I click the pair subpaths button, and now you click from each one and you match up the paths that need to match and move together. So as you can see, as I progress through this animation and match them together, now the bars are like not moving around, they're not reordering themselves. There's just the two in the middle that are moving, okay? But you saw that they weren't really like elongating, they were like moving around and stretching in a weird way. So that's the next thing that we want to correct. So how do we do that correction? Well, what we have is, there is this auto magic tool at the top, so you can see the animation doesn't look so right. If you press the little like magic wand button, what this does is it tries to find the shortest distance between the points in the two separate subpaths, and then matches those two to try and get the shortest subpath and try and do that animation a bit better. Obviously, sometimes this doesn't work exactly because it doesn't really know exactly what you want to animate. I was lucky in this case in that it animated it for me, or fixed it for me. But if it didn't, we would have to, there's another tool on this UI that allows you to actually set where the points start and like move the points around so that you can get that elongated effect. So this is the final animation that we have now between these two icons. And that's exactly what I was going for. I wanted this like stretchy effect that would happen, and that's what I got to. So it looks a lot better now, right? Yeah, cool. So how do I actually now use this within my app? Well, what you would need to do at this point is in the Shapeshifter tool, export it to an AnimatedVectorDrawable, and this will be obviously for the Android app. If you wanted to do it for iOS or web, you would obviously use something else. But at this point now, we have our exported XML file. We place that within our drawable folder on Android. And in code to actually run the animation, we would create or get a drawable from resources. So in this case, I'm getting the send to justify animation that we've just made. Set that on image view. And then if I wanted to get notified when this animation was finished, I would add an animation callback listener, and I can do something with it. In this case, I'm just going to show a toast. And then to actually show the animation, we just call, on click of the button, we call drawable as animatable and .start, and that'll just fire off the animation for us to run. And this is how it looks within the app. So we have our little animation. So obviously we would probably go back and forth between these two. So we would need to add another vector drawable for the reverse animation. Or if it was like a single state and you just wanted to show the transition, in your actual Shapeshifter animation file, you would probably do the reverse of what you've just done in that file itself. But if we have single states for each one, we would probably need to create new vector drawables per animation. Okay, cool. So looking at another tool called Lottie. Sorry, that was awkward. Okay, so what is Lottie? So Lottie is a tool that is used for cross-platform complex animations. So it's created by Airbnb, and it allows designers that are used to using After Effects, which is not me, somebody who's used to using After Effects to export an animation from there using a plugin called Body Moving. And you can use this animation within your Android, iOS, and web apps. And the nice part about Lottie is that it allows you to like sort of scrub the animation. So if you remember with vector drawables, you couldn't really set a certain point and say like only want 50% of the animation to be done. Lottie, you can set certain positions of your progress. And another thing is that you can download them on demand. So they're basically just JSON files that you include. And if you don't want to bloat your app, you can, or you don't need those animations until a certain point in time, you can download them on the fly when you need them. And there is a website that allows you to download a whole bunch of cool animations, lottiefiles.com. So if you make some animations, you can also share them on there. And it's just a nice place also just for inspiration if you want to see what you can do with it. But here is a basic example of how to use it. You just add the dependency in your Android app and then import this a view. You can add a Lottie animation view and then set the resource to whatever your animation is. And then you can say autoplay or loop or whatever you want it to do. I'm not going to go too much further into Lottie, mainly because After Effects scares me and I don't really want to demonstrate that. So, next thing. Property animations. So this is probably one of the easier ways to animate something on Android. And basically what you use when you use this is something called a view property animator. And this allows you to animate specific properties on a view. And these are like common properties that are around for all different kinds of views, like your scale, your X, your Y, your rotation, your alpha, that kind of thing. This is also a fire and forget, so you can't like scrub it to a certain point. And this is a very user-friendly API, in my opinion. It's very nice to use. It's very like understandable what you're actually doing with it. And it's also more efficient when you're doing like a bunch of animations at once, so you can group them all together and run them as a set, that kind of thing. So how do we use it? Well, we take the view that we want to animate, so in this case it's an image view, and we say .animate. And then from that point on, we can set the alpha, rotation, whatever we want to animate to. We give it those values that it must go, that it must animate to. We can give it a duration of how long it must last, and we can also give it an end action, so something that you want to be performed once the animation is finished. So maybe setting visibility or showing a toast or something. And then you call start, and that'll just run the animation for you, and you will see cool effects happening on your image view. So this is how it looks in the example app. So I'm animating the golden ticket. And basically, I'm just setting a whole bunch of different animations on this one. Maybe you're probably not going to do something like this in your app, but it just shows that you can do alpha, rotation, scaling, that kind of thing. Okay. So having a look at custom view animations. So custom view animations, if you were in my talk yesterday, you may remember I talked about custom views. But what if you wanted to like take it from a level of just drawing a custom view to actually animating things that you're drawing on screen? So this is for when your built-in animations just don't cut it. You have maybe you've tried just using view property animator or AnimatedVectorDrawables, but you've got your own custom view with a background that needs to animate or needs to zoom in and out, that kind of thing. So you're probably going to go down this route of using a custom view animation. And you're probably animating custom properties on a view. So for instance, things like a color or a radius or a shadow or a matrix if you were zooming in and out or doing some scaling, that kind of thing. And that's what you would use with a custom view animation. So how do you actually perform a custom view animation? You would need to use something called this property values holder, and that basically holds information about a property and its values during an animation. So you can create these animations using the value animator class or object animator. The value animator basically just animates from certain values to start and end values, and you need to do the setting yourself, whereas object animator can go and animate on those certain properties for you. The example we'll be doing is with a value animator. So in my example, I want to animate some text that I'm drawing in a custom view, and I'm saying I want to animate it to a certain size, so I want to scale it up, and I want to change its color as well. So to do this, I create two property values holder. So the first one is a text color, and that I give it the property text color, and I say the start color that I'm going to start at and the color that I want to go to. And then a text size, so the size that it is currently and the size it must go to. And then we create this value animator dot of property values holder. We give it in all the properties that we want to animate. And then we want to apply certain things to it. So the first thing we want to apply is the evaluator. This is for animating text colors, or just colors. And the ARGB evaluator is a part of the Android classes. So it's not something I've written custom, but basically it does the interpolation between two color values and animates them. We set a duration and then an update listener. So the update listener will be fired on every frame of the animation. And now in this update listener, we can get the current text size that we need and the current color that we're going to be animating to. So we would then set them on our custom view. So we have our custom setter for the size and color. And in that setter, we would call invalidate. Okay. And then our custom view would run that's on draw again. And our color would be changing on each frame of this animation. We call start, and that'll trigger the animation to run. So this is an example of this custom view animation. We are just animating between two different colors and the text size as well. And this is text that we've drawn on the canvas ourselves manually. So this is a very simple example, but obviously you can take this further. So this is one example of how we've used it in the app that I work on. And basically we have this concept of layers that you put on top of an image. And in this example, it's a text layer that I'm clicking on. And what we want to do is when we provide more tools to a user, being able to remove parts of the text or fade it out, we want to be able to animate in to zoom into that layer. So if you click on the mask tool or something like that, you'll see it actually zooms in and animates to that certain layer. And this is done using a custom view animation. Okay. So the next kind of animation that we can have a look at is what we call physics-based animations. So physics-based animations are also known as dynamic animations, and that is the name of the repository on the Android, the Gradle properties that you pull in, or the Gradle file. And why I think it's called dynamic animations is because it can be different every single time you use it. So they are typically driven by a force, and in this case, a force is a gesture, so moving or scrolling super fast. If you're used to using a list, or you scroll on Twitter or something, you can you can scroll it, and the force of your gesture determines how fast that recycler view moves. So the thing that people say about physics-based animations is that they're more natural looking because they are responding to how a user has interacted with that control. And a nice thing to note about using them is that you don't specify a duration because it's physics properties, right? When you are in real life dropping a ball from your hand, you can't say to the ball, okay, take 200 milliseconds. It's going to take as long as it needs with gravity and all those properties applied to it. And that's why you can't specify a certain duration, because it's just not naturally something that you would do. So one thing to note as well with physics-based animations is that you can reconfigure it midway and your velocity is recalculated and your animation just does a turnaround and really animates quite nicely between them. Whereas with something like property animations, it might just cut it off in midway and start with the new results and not look as smooth as if you were using these physics ones. So there are two physics-based animations that you can use at the moment. The one is a spring animation and the other is a fling animation. So a fling animation, you're probably very used to with recycler views because it's something that is built in out of the box. But basically, what you do to create a fling animation is you can give it in the view that you want and what direction, translation Y, or what property you want to animate on this view. So there's a bunch of built-in ones like translation Y, translation X. And then you can set a start velocity. So obviously, you probably at this point wanted to base it on what the user has scrolled, the velocity of the gesture that they've done. And then the friction obviously specifies how quickly it would slow down, or if you want it to be like really sticky, you probably want to set your friction value a bit higher. And then you would call start, and that would obviously start your animation. Okay, so this is an example of the animating the golden ticket as well. This is not based on like a gesture, this is just a button press, but in that example app, we have fling animations, so you can play around with just like, you can see as soon as like I click the button a few times, it adjusts it and recalculates. So there's an example of the spring animation as well within this one, but we'll look a little bit more at how to use the spring animation now. Okay, so the spring animation in this example, I'm using a color dropper that we have within our app. If you watched my talk yesterday, I talked a little bit about how we actually draw this color dropper. But to animate it, so if you press on a certain portion of the screen while the color dropper is active, it actually uses a spring animation to like go to that new position and like bounces between them. So here you can see I'm pressing on the screen at different points, and it animates with the spring animation to get or move that to that point. So how do you use a spring animation, or how was that one done particularly? Well, you need to use these float property compat classes from Android, and basically what you say, you specify what must happen when a set value is called and what must happen when a get value is called. And the underlying spring animation will use these two getters and setters to actually perform the animation. So in this case, I've got two, I'm only showing one, but I've got two for the X and Y position that the color dropper is shown on screen. So when set X is called, it actually just redraws on screen, and then every time we call spring animation, it'll animate individually calling invalidate on each frame call. So to actually use that spring animation, we create a spring animation class, and we say, we give it the property this, which is just the custom view that I was in, and we give it the X, the property compat object that we had before, that animation X, so it knows how to actually set or what to set when the animation is running, and how to get values from it. And then we want to animate point X. So that is the point that we want to go to, and that'll be producing this animation. And then we can apply certain different things. So we can apply the stiffness and the damping ratio on this animation. And I'll show you a few visual examples of what these look like and what they mean. But these are the default values that get set, and they normally look pretty good. And then you call start to trigger the animation. So there is a nice KTX extension for dynamic animations that makes this a lot cleaner to work with. So forget about that float property compat object that we had to make. This new spring animation class or extension, basically all we need to do is give it the setter and the getter that it needs to trigger and use, and the point, the value that we want to go to. So it's much cleaner, don't have to create that extra object. And then I can do the certain things. So setter, getter, the point I want to go to, and then the stiffness and the damping ratio if I want to specify those. So let's have a look at the different stiffness options that we get. So you can set things like stiffness low, medium, and high. The low stiffness, you can see it's more like a slinky. If anyone knows what a slinky is, it's like that toy that kids have that's different colors, and it's a spring basically. So this one kind of looks like that. It's not very stiff when you pull it. It's very wobbly. Medium is obviously gets a little bit more stiff, and then high is probably like a metal spring that's a little bit harder to pull apart and let loose. Okay. And then having a look at the damping ratio, it's also obviously just different options that you can provide, so low, medium, and high. And this just specifies the bouncy effect, which is probably my favorite. So low bouncy means there's no bouncing happening on screen, or a little bit. Medium bouncy, there's a little bit of slight bounce at the end of the animation. And then high bouncy, it's really next level bounce, maybe a little bit too much for this example. Okay. So we've had a look at different kinds of spring animation, physics-based animation, that kind of thing. But now let's have a look at the sort of newer kid on the block, which is MotionLayout. So, what is motion layout? For those that don't know, it is basically a subclass of constraint layout. So everything that you use with constraint layout works with motion layout, and it allows you to do these really sort of complex element animations and UI animations between elements on screen. So it's a completely different type of animation system. So you would probably still be using things like custom view animations or little property animations, and motion layout might be something that you use on top, just because it's something that is for a whole UI that you show on screen. And it's also gesture driven, so you can do things like scrolling up and down, and it triggers certain points of your animation. You can also set the progress of it, so you can like stop it at a certain point if you want to, or depend a view pager on it or something like that. And there's a really quite powerful what you can do with motion layout. And it's very useful for transitioning between different layout states. So if you have a start state of your animation and you want to transition to like a loading state or something like that, you might want to use motion layout to get that nicer animation and set a certain state. And it's also defined in XML. So we'll have a look at the editor and how you can use that. But basically, you create this motion scene XML file, and that drives the whole animation. So you don't need to define anything in code. You might want to, which you also can do, but it's mostly done in XML. So this is a basic example of the motion layout, of how to use it. So this, I like to think of as like a Twitter or some kind of social media clone, where there's a bunch of tweets and the profile pictures at the top. And normally when you drag up on that like recycler view, that like profile picture disappears or gets a bit smaller and animates, and so you got a little bit more screen space on your screen. So this is easily achieved in motion layout by using the drag up action. And we'll have a look at like the motion scene of how this layout is created. So this is the XML that is created, or that we need to create. You might look at using something like the new motion editor to generate this, because it can be a little bit harder to read. But it is good to know what it's doing and how it works, just so that if the editor isn't giving you exactly what you need, you know exactly how to edit it. But if we look at this example, we have in our motion scene file, we define a transition. And this transition, we set the start state constraints and the end state constraints of our layout. And we specify a certain duration, and then we specify the action that needs to happen in order to trigger this transition. So in this case, we have an on swipe that we want to trigger. So when I swipe on the recycler view status, which is the touch anchor ID, I want to do this transition that I've defined from start to end state. And we can specify the drag direction, so we want to drag up the state change, and the anchor side that we want to do. So that's for a little bit more complex interactions with it. Okay, so we've got this transition, but we don't have the start and end state of this layout. Like, how does it get from one point to the other? So we define these constraint sets within this XML, this motion scene XML. So we have our start constraint set, and in our start constraint set, all we want to do is have that background of that, I don't know if you remember, the pink background of the profile picture. We want that to be hidden, and that must only come up when I start dragging. But everything else must remain as if nothing has changed from the layout that we have already. And then the end state, what we want to do is we want to have that avatar image. We want to change the size, the width and height. We want it to be, instead of like 100 dp, we want it to scale down to 40 dp. And we possibly want to change some of the constraints. Like we want to set the, I don't know, to constrain it to something else. We can do that here. And then we also want to animate the background in. So we want the alpha of the background to now go from 0 to 1. Okay? And if you've been following any of the Android Dev Summit announcements, the motion editor is now in Android Studio Preview. So you need to use the latest version of Constraint Layout. I think it's beta 3. But basically, this gives you an editor to actually create those motion scene files. So you can see here, when I was running that animation, let's see if it'll work again. You can actually click on the certain transition and then play it back within Android Studio. So you don't need to run it on a device. You can pause it. You can add your certain constraints at certain points. It's really quite a powerful editor for motion layout, even though I think it's still in preview. So there's a few features missing, but it really is quite a cool new feature in the new Android Studio. So definitely check that out and play around with it and see if you can create cool animations with motion layout. And just a reminder of what it looked like. Whoops, that was too quick. Yeah. Yeah, so that's just the constraint layout motion layout running on that Veruca Salt image. So it was just two constraints, or one constraint that changed, and the background that animated in and out. And this is automatically handled with the recycler view, dragging it up and down. Okay, but you can do way more complex things with motion layouts. So one of the other things you can do with motion layout is use something called key attributes. So this allows you to specify certain parts of your animation, certain views, or certain things must happen. So I can state at, it typically goes from a 0 to 100 frame position. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom, I can, at maybe like 60% of my animation, I can set that a view is fully visible at that time and maybe change some other things to happen between 60 and 100%. So this is quite cool because then you can do like scroll this thing in, then display this, then show this, all using motion layout key attributes. So how do we actually do this? Well, within that transition object in the motion scene file, we would add this key attributes tag, and then you specify the frame position that it must happen at and what you want the target values to be at that point. So in this example, I want my image view that is called image view banner middle because it's very descriptive. And at 60% of this animation, I want my translation Y to be back to nothing, to be back at 0. So if there is something like -60 set on it, by 60% of the animation, it'll be fully animated and it won't move anymore, at least with this translation Y. And then you can add a whole bunch more. So there's custom ones that you can do, so you can animate your custom properties if you want, but this is sort of a simple example of what you can do with it. So if you wanted to invoke your layout or your transition within code, because sometimes if you have it specified to only happen on a certain button, but maybe in my case I wanted to animate it when the screen opened, I can also set this transition to end or get access to that subscription or that motion layout object and call transition to the certain state that I wanted to transition to, and this will invoke the animation programmatically through code. So this is an example of using the keyframes animation. So we have a subscription screen that obviously we want people to pay for our app at some point. So when you click to get the subscription screen, we use this key attributes to and this frame positions in order to open up and animate things to certain points at certain times. And that is all driven using motion layout and that motion scene file. So just to recap, these are the example repos if you want to have a look at them. So I have a constraint layout or the animation example GitHub, and then the constraint layout samples. I can't remember if that links to the Google samples or if it links to mine, but there is also one on my repository and in Google. So be sure to check those two out just for the different types of animations. And we covered all these different kinds. So we covered animated vector drawables, we covered Shapeshifter, Lottie, property animations, custom view animations, and motion layouts. But like I mentioned at the start, there are many other ways to animate things in Android. So there's transitions, transition managers, activity scenes, animator sets, and probably more third-party libraries and stuff like that. But I'm not going to spend the whole day going through all of them. So often I get a lot of people asking me the question, this is great, Rebecca, you've presented all these different kinds of animation, but when do I use which option? And There was this great talk by Nick Butcher and a few others from Google where I've linked it down below, where they talk about which animation to use at certain points. But I'll just be sort of recapping that little bit of the talk that I really enjoyed. So basically, when you have a complex layout with many different moving parts on screen, or you have like a gesture, like a recycler view that triggers some kind of animation, you would use something like MotionLayout. But if you want it to be an interruptible animation, or you want to do something dynamic, like make it based on force, that kind of thing, then you would look at using the physics or dynamic animation. And then if you have like a shared element between screens, like a fragment and like a list that contains it, and then we're going to go to the details of it, or you have window content that you want to share between, you would use the Transitions API, which I didn't cover today. And if you want to do like a vector graphic animation, you would probably use AnimatedVectorDrawables, like we discussed first on. Those are typically for those small little icon animations. Maybe you want to look at also using Lottie from your designers, if they can make more complex ones at that point. And then if you have window animation, so if you want to do things on your actual window, you would probably then at that point use view animations. And then if you have properties on a view, like alpha, scale, that kind of thing, at this point you probably want to use a view property animator. And then if none of those really fit the bill and it doesn't really work out as what you want, you probably, for a custom view, you want to be using a value animator. Or if you want to do like general purpose property animation, like animating certain custom properties on a view, you probably want to look at using object animator as well. So, many different options for all the different types of animation on Android, but hopefully this excerpt from that talk helps you a lot, because it really helped me, which is why I wanted to include it in this one. But the last thing that I want to leave you with is, oops, not that one. Spend some time learning the available tools within Android, because there are a bunch, and that doesn't animate anymore. Okay, very important animation, but spend some time learning the tools that are available for you within Android, and it'll help you make some great Android animations within your app. So thank you so much for coming to my animation factory. Hopefully you learned something, and feel free to catch me after the talk, or I don't know if we have time for questions, maybe? Good, a few questions, cool.